Hi, I'm Jackie Russell, and this is Talking Nonprofits with Teak Media. Today, we're here with Jen Harrington from Hatch, which is a branding and recruitment talent agency based out of Cambridge. And we're going to talk to Jen today about rebranding and when nonprofits should rebrand and what the problems they have with rebranding and how they can overcome the challenges. So, thanks for being here, Jen. Tell us a little bit about Hatch.
Well, I think you said it pretty well. Hatch is a branding agency, and we also have a talent and recruitment arm. So we work with clients, mostly marketing organizations, in a variety of different ways, depending on what their needs are. But most of what we specialize in is helping organizations with rebrands.
Right. So you've been hearing from nonprofits lately about when should I rebrand, right? Is that been a challenge? What do you tell them?
Well, usually we try to understand where they are in their own branding cycle. But typically, the reason that nonprofits are calling is because they've just gone through a strategic planning process and they're starting to evaluate their brand against their strategic plans.
And what are they finding when they do that?
What we're hearing a lot, and I think what we're seeing a lot, is that many of the strategic plans, especially post COVID, are very focused on attracting more diverse audiences. So that is a huge driver for whether the brand is actually connecting with the audiences that they're hoping to engage with. So I'd say that's probably the primary driver. The other thing that we've seen a lot of is sort of the run towards capital campaigns post COVID. And so those capital campaign efforts are also often part of a strategic plan, and how they can position themselves or talk about their mission and the efforts around the capital campaign also tend to garner a lot of attention around whether the brand is working as hard as it can.
Hmm. So what do you tell them? Like how and when should they rebrand?
We usually ask a lot of questions about who is the most important group of stakeholders for the success of their organization and how well they feel or how well they're monitoring their engagement with those audiences and what it is that they're actually trying to achieve. So, what are the measurable goals that they want to hold themselves accountable to as it relates to engagement and experiences with their audiences?
Hmm. What Give us a little bit of background. What exactly is a rebrand?
Well, rebrands come in lots of different shapes and sizes. And what I would say is very often rebrand is a scary word, and particularly for nonprofits, which tend to be older organizations with very significant donor pools. That's a really scary word. We usually talk about it more around brand refresh, which is really about taking everything about the brand that is special and the equity that they've built over years and figuring out how to pivot that a bit to address where they're headed and connect, as I said before, with some new audiences.
Hmm. So it's not a whole overhaul type of thing.
More trying to pull from who they are and what makes them special and tell that story in a more engaging way that's aligned with where they're headed. So sometimes, I think people think about, oh, a rebrand, it must mean that we're going to dump everything that we say, our logo, all of these things, and then we're going to show up as a completely new organization. And I think that is a terrifying thought for a lot of nonprofits, actually for any brand. But really, a rebrand is more of a recalibration. How do we take who we are and what we're saying and how we show up and the types of experiences that we deliver and align them a little better to the needs and the desires of the audience as it relates to increasing either engagement, or in the case of a nonprofit, it could be membership or visitorship or donor support. It sort of depends on what their goals are.
So I've heard you talk about the three A's in terms of audit, articulate, and activate when it comes to helping a nonprofit refresh their brand. What does that mean exactly?
There are three steps of a process. The first audit is about assessing your existing brand equity. And we use that information to sort of craft a way forward for the brand, again, using all of that equity as part of it. The second step is articulate. So, how can we take everything we learned in the audit phase and find a way to build a platform, a visual, verbal, and other platform for how the brand can engage in the real world? And articulate is sort of the choreographed dance for how you launch the brand and how it shows up in the world.
That sounds very complicated, is it?
No. Well, actually, it's really fun. It's a hugely collaborative process,
That's great.
and it's thorough, and it should be thorough because one of the most important assets for a nonprofit organization or any organization is their brand. So it should be thoughtful, and it should be conscientious, and it should be caring. And we try to keep those things in mind when we go through that process. I think it sounds very long. To be very honest, it can be done in a relatively short period of time, or it can be done sort of in steps, and be highly collaborative or inclusive. One thing we find with nonprofits, they have a lot of constituents. So when you get to an audit phase or an articulate phase in particular, incorporating internal members of the organization as well as the board or key donors is really important, and it might slow the process down, but it creates buy-in that's hugely valuable at the activate stage.
Mm. That you're bringing up a point that makes me curious about how do you reach, like, your donors can be so different than the audience that you're trying to reach. And can one brand be meaningful to both?
One brand has to be meaningful to both.
Yeah.
The biggest mistakes I have ever seen in nonprofit branding is when there's an over calibration either to the markets that nonprofit serves or the donors. It needs to be able to meet the needs of both.
Mm, that sounds tricky.
Well, I think that's why the audit phase is so important, because part of what you do is you spend time talking to people that are part of those stakeholder groups. So you spend time talking to customers or the individuals that nonprofit serves, depending on what their mission is or their orientation, but also spend time talking to employees and the board and key donors and other constituents that are important to the success of the mission. And when you get that kind of input and insight in that first phase, it makes the subsequent phases better, more focused, and more successful.
Yeah. And so finally, what is the solution that you achieve? What does a brand really need to do? And what is the solutions that a well thought out and created brand can achieve for a nonprofit?
Well, I think one of the things that we, again, not to keep going back to the first phase, but one of the most important parts, probably before the three A's come into the picture, is what are you trying to do? What are the objectives for the organization? What role does the brand play in that? And how are you going to measure its success? So those are things that are important to ask on the very, very front end, and then build ways to measure that over time. Sometimes it's things like your fundraising goals, the number of members you have, the amount of activity that you have, on your website or engaged in events, or a whole host of different things. We usually look at a series of metrics across sort of the funnel and try to put some benchmarks in place that will allow an organization to chart its success, not just as a brand, but as an organization with specific business and development goals.
I'm sure you're very helpful to many nonprofits.
We try.
So, yeah. And I know it's from experience, it's really rewarding work, right?
Yes, very rewarding, very rewarding. Mission-based organizations have so much to share and so much to tell. And it's actually an honor to be able to work with them around their
I
brand.
agree with that. I agree with that. I'm glad that they have somebody like you to help them get through the process. So thanks, and thanks for being with
Thank
us
you.
today.
Thank you.